Welcome back to the State of Cultivated Meat in Australia conference. Now it's time for our final session today, session 3. It's all about the future landscape of cultivated meat. Our speakers will be talking about the regulation of cultivated meat, the role of students and young professionals in accelerating the alternative protein innovation, and the future of cultivated meat startups and research in Australia. In this session, we have Hope Johnson, Jacob Goodwin, and Dean Powell talking about cultivated meat, where it's at, and where it's going. I will introduce you to each speaker before their talks, and at the very end, we will have a panel discussion and Q&A. So definitely get your burning questions ready. Make sure to add these questions under the Q&A section as well. And at 5 p.m. AEST, there will be a very relaxed networking session where you'll be joined by attendees and maybe even panelists to mingle and chat about the conference, among other things. So the Zoom link for this will be on Eventbrite and the Facebook pages. It will also be posted below in the chats. So let's get right into session 3, Future Landscape of Cultivated Meat. First up, we have Dr. Hope Johnson, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Law at Queensland University of Technology. She uses socio-legal methods to research in food and agricultural law, regulation, and governance. Hope has published on the global governance of food systems as well as Australia's regulation of food. Her current research is focused on the regulation and politics of alternative proteins. So welcome, Hope, and good luck. Hope to take it away.
Thanks so much for that introduction. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, great. And that all looks good on your end too?
Yep, looks great.
Cool. So I'll recognise the traditional owners of the land on which I am giving this talk from today, which is the Turrbal and Yugara. The lands on which I'm on have always been places of learning and teaching. So I'm going to be talking you through broadly the regulatory response that we're going to see or likely to see with cell cultured meat, and then also some of the key themes in the regulatory debate around cell cultured meat that may shape regulatory responses or perhaps should shape regulatory responses. So those are the kinds of things that I'll be talking about. So in terms of the general scope of regulatory responses for cell cultured meat, and I'll just slip into the language of alternative proteins because sometimes I'll be thinking about plant-based precision fermentation type stuff, which is not quite cell cultured, but I'll just kind of use those terms interchangeably. But firstly, many alternative protein products will be subject to existing either new or existing pre-market approval processes. So for instance, in the US, technically they don't actually have a pre-market approval process for foods, novel foods, which was flagged in the previous session. They mentioned, I think it was Susie mentioned, Bazant and novel food approval. In the US, they don't have that kind of a system in place where there is a pre-market approval process for some new food products. But the way that their regulatory debates and discussions have been evolving to date indicates that they're probably going to have their own niche pre-market approval process for cell cultured products. In Australia, we expect our existing pre-market approval process for novel foods to suffice, as it has, at least that's what Fazance has been saying about a year ago. I'll circle back to what is the pre-market approval process for cell cultured foods? What is it likely to be? It also seems likely that each country will create standards around production and processing for precision fermentation and for cell cultured products. And these will focus on acute food safety risks. So for instance, it might be standards around avoiding cell culture contamination, standards around the qualities that bioreactors require, how often bioreactors need to be cleaned, etc. Those kinds of things, temperature checks, all of that type of stuff. Which obviously we don't currently have. Depending on the jurisdiction, there may be inspection of facilities. In the US, there's definitely going to be some kind of inspection of facilities, probably carried out by the USDA perhaps, but that's all sort of up for debate and discussion. Right now in Australia, there are only inspections of food manufacturing facilities in certain circumstances and for certain products, so whether that's extended out, we'll see. I think it's likely that there'll be some kind of fortification and reformulation requirements. So what we've seen there was a recent interesting study in the British Journal of Nutrition, which examined the nutritional implications of displacing meats with meat alternatives. and which actually has not been done previously. And their results indicated that meat alternatives can be a good, healthy alternative if chosen correctly. So it's likely that regulators will be requiring that these types of products be fortified with things like maybe B12 if they require them, or that they that we pay attention to their particular nutritional profile and require certain things. So in Australia right now, we have specific fortification requirements around bread and cereal, for instance, and it could be that those types of requirements are extended out. We will expect to see countries create standards around food labels and descriptors. Some of you might know we had a Senate inquiry into definitions of meat in Australia in 2021. So basically there's at the parliament level, different parliamentarians can conduct inquiries into issues. And one of their key things that they conducted an inquiry on, one of these panels, was to look at the definitions of meat and meat labels. And you probably are aware that that is a hot topic in the regulatory space. They particularly concluded there that they're not going to talk about cell cultured meat products, but they wanted a mandatory label for plant-based meat products to really specify that they're not actually meat per se. So whilst they put cell cultured meat in the too hard basket, we are a large agricultural producing nation. We have the National Party, which is closely tied to large agricultural rural industries. So we can expect to see some more political developments around that space in Australia and in other countries. We can also expect to see court challenges in this space to varying degrees. We already have seen them, of course. It is an area that is contested by actors with resources, and we've already seen law used in this space to shape consumer and regulator perspectives. So speaking very broadly here, legal court challenges are likely to feature in our regulatory responses and change what kinds of regulations evolve and how different actors see cell cultured meat. Finally, we might see some additional legislative responses that aren't typical. So for instance, in the US, a key discourse or a key concern has been the mixing of cell cultured meat with traditional conventional meat. And so perhaps like in that context, we might see some prohibitions around intermixing. So there's probably some regulatory things that we're not even really aware of yet. And that could be an example of that. In terms of the pre-market approval process in Australia, each cell cultured meat product, unless it has received prior approval, is very, very highly likely to require pre-market approval by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. We have a rare situation where Australia and New Zealand have the same food regulator that sets standards and approves foods. In Australia, if a food, in New Zealand, if a food is a novel food, so a food that hasn't traditionally been consumed and may raise public health and safety issues, if a food is produced using a gene technology, which has actually quite a narrow definition and means more of your traditional gene technology, and if a food is a nutritive substance or a processing aid, then it will trigger a pre-market approval of that product unless it has been subjected to that before. Now, the pre-market approval process for cell cultured meat is likely to be major, meaning it will involve 2 rounds of public consultations, and it will involve a focus on a scientific risk assessment, so weighing up scientific evidence. FSANZ will gather from the industry itself, the industry looking to approve a particular product, so the business wanting to get their product out there, but also looking at the desktop review of what evidence we have about the safety of particular components. FSANZ also conducts a qualitative cost-benefit analysis, looking at the benefit of approving this product for sale versus the cost of approving this product for sale for various actors in various ways. The final say on whether a cell cultured meat product will be approved and allowed into the Australian market will be held by a ministerial forum. So although we have this regulator FSANZ that does all of that work, they can then recommend something to this forum of ministers, but the forum of ministers can ultimately decide if it will approve it or if it will send it back to FSANZ and things like that. That's why things will probably get political even more so, because we'll have ministers from various portfolios in Australia and New Zealand with various perspectives and constituents. In terms of the pre-market approval process, as I indicated, it is going to be really focused on hazards. We've sort of had a brief chat about hazards in the earlier sessions. There's not anything really new in this space in terms of hazards as such. They're the same kinds of hazards that we've seen with previous novel foods, pharmaceuticals, etc. There is obviously a combination of new inputs and processes used, and so each process will require a different consideration. There will be things that we have to consider, like bacteria. The potential hazards could be bacteria and viruses, the use of antibiotics and hormones, the particular methods used to store cells and those storage conditions, the contamination of cells, the structural and chemical changes that might occur once cell cultured products are subjected to processing. These are types of hazards that a regulator will be considering. One particular issue in this space is the strong role of industry-funded science that has come up again and again in the regulatory debate. So regulators often rely on the business that is seeking to have their product approved, the business showing scientific evidence that its product is safe. That's just a common custom in the area, whether we agree with that or not. But what we can see from stakeholder debates in the US and Australia is that people actually want independent scientific evidence. So they want arm's length assessment of these products. We do not have a team of scientists in the government that individually conduct assessments of these products. And we do not have a system in place, such as other countries have, where there's an independent set of ability to independently kind of contract to academics that is more of an arm's length deal where they sort of assess the safety of different things. So there has been a bit of a critique on the reliance on businesses conducting their own safety studies and that being our main source of evidence. That can undermine consumer trust in various ways. And talking quickly here, because I suspect I'm running out of time, the cell cultured meat space is something that we should be a little bit more critical of when we're thinking of it from a regulatory perspective and we're thinking about the future of food and what we want that future to be like. One of the key kind of discourses in this space that's problematic is this idea that cell cultured meat is necessary for food security. Now, food security is, the world already produces enough food. The FAO has said that it's not concerned about meeting future production levels. There is no protein deficiency in Australia or other developed countries. The drivers of food insecurity are poverty. And so if we want to address food security, we need to be having a conversation about poverty, not creating another ultra-processed food product on the market that is a more lucrative cost. So that's definitely coming through in the critiques and the debates around cell-cultured meat, is that we need to be thinking a little bit more broadly about what issues are being solved here and what issues aren't being solved or perhaps being overlooked. So I might skip to the last kind of point that I would want to make, which is there's a range of problems that regulators may need to draw their attention to and are being called on by stakeholders to look at that haven't so far featured in those regulatory responses that I identified. The first is health implications of diets high in red and processed meat, regardless of the source of that meat, so cell cultured or conventional. Another one is the need for regulatory measures that promote whole grains and fruits and vegetables, more sustainable, under-consumed. Those kinds of products are probably more important from a public interest perspective to be pursuing and pushing for. The health implications of diets high in ultra-processed foods is an ongoing discussion, especially in the public nutrition space. There is also an issue around this cultural and food marketing emphasis on protein, which is sort of a reductionist understanding of nutrition that suits food marketers, but is not actually consistent with public health nutrition. And then finally, and this was a bit of a theme in the first session, there is a risk of corporate consolidation in this space, especially tied with IP and things like that. And that's something that regulators should be aware of. As we've seen in the conventional meat space, corporate consolidation is generally against the public interest. So that's definitely something that regulators should be addressing and thinking about. Not to also overlook, not to underemphasize the issues with conventional meat. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, seems like there's still, quite a bit of challenges for the regulatory processes with cultivated meat, and also, yeah, a lot of questions to be answered, to be quite honest, right? So yeah, I want to hear more from the other speakers and see what they think as well, and we can have a panel discussion later on as well. So thank you very much. The regulation is one of the key questions I think people ask about all the time. So thank you for that. Thank you. All right, so next up we have Dr. Jacob Goodwin, who is the operations manager at Magic Valley, the world's first cultivated lamb company. He has over 15 years experience in cell biology and stem cell differentiation. Prior to Magic Valley, Jacob worked as a postdoctoral researcher where he gained expertise in cancer model development, drug discovery, and in vitro and in vivo drug development and characterization. He has held postdoctoral positions at Karolinska Institutet in Sweden and CSIRO in Australia. Hopefully I pronounced it right. Welcome, Jacob. Thank you. Take it away.
Cheers. Thank you for the introduction. Let me just share my screen.
Okay. Yeah, it's looking good.
So yeah, as I said, my name is Jacob Goodwin. I'm actually got a bit of an upgrade. So I'm now the head of innovations at Magic Valley. So we're a cultured meat company, and we're focused on the production of lamb products, and we're located here in Brunswick. We're still a fairly early stage cultivated meat company. I guess this talk is to talk about how I see the future of cultivated meat startups in Australia and how they'll function based on my experience in the space. So I guess to talk about what's going to happen, we need to know where we are. And so you probably have seen this today already, but SciTech Australia put this together, and it's a more global look at the cellular agriculture startup space in Australia. So if we were just to look at what's happening in cultivated meat, we'd have a very sort of small slide. So I thought I'd include everything, and also a lot of these companies are sort of intertwined in the technologies that are required. So it's sort of important to recognize that they're important as well. So in terms of cultivated meat companies in Australia, we have ourselves and Powell, who have spoken today and are focused on more exotic species of meat. In the culture media space, also we've spoken today, we've got Huros, who are developing cell culture medias and cast materials for scaffolds. I like to include the precision fermentation because this can feed directly into the cultured meat space. So there are, I guess, multiple avenues of approaching, I guess, the construction of our meat products. And one of those has been to look at producing specific types of fatty acids to mix into our products. So fats provide a lot of taste and smell, which are associated with meat products. And it may be easier to get to market if we use precision fermentation for parts of the process, rather than trying to make an adipocide that has the right sort of combination of fats for appropriate taste. Other important players, obviously, the universities and the nonprofits such as GFI and SciTech Australia and all sorts of things, and a bunch of investors that are also in the space. So it's important to sort of recognize everyone. If we then look at cultured meat globally, we can see that there's been an extreme expansion since 2016 in the number of cultivated meat companies, and this expands from your traditional agricultural species, including like beef and pigs primarily, and things such as crustaceans and other aquatic species and the more exotic animals. And this really is mirrored in the investment over the last few years into the cultivated meat and also cell ag as a larger whole, where we've seen an exponential increase in funding. And this is also what we're seeing as a trend here in Australia. So obviously, you probably don't need to spend much time on this slide, but I think it just puts into context the rest of the talk. So obviously, we're trying to make a cultivated meat product, and we're starting with an animal source and to try and isolate cells. And this could be fibroblasts to do some reprogramming to make iPSCs, or you may be doing embryonic stem cells, or taking muscle biopsies and isolating satellite cells for your process. So there's multiple avenues. So then we have establishment of cell lines, which then need to be expanded in bioreactors and differentiated. And then finally to form the products that we're trying to sell. So these are sort of spread the gamut of unstructured proteins for minces and sausages and those sorts of things. And then using technologies, including bioprinting, to produce something that has more of the look and the texture of a traditional cut of meat. So it's a quite complex process, obviously. And in terms of the opportunities for startups in the space, they sort of fall into two different categories. So we have B2B businesses, which are business to business, and we have B2C, which is business to consumer. So companies such as Powell and ourselves, we're B2C, where we're trying to produce a meat product to produce directly for the consumer. But all along the way, there are a myriad of B2B businesses who provide research and their components for media and scaffolding and basically anything that you can think of along the way. There's someone that can help provide a solution for that. So there's, in terms of the startup space that's available, there's a myriad of opportunities and directions that we can take. So just summarize that in this. So there's cell lines, and cell line development is a huge thing. So one of the big hurdles is getting appropriate cell lines. So for example, producing iPSCs, if that's the route you want to take from animals, has been challenging from livestock species. And there are companies like Roslin-Tech who have a commercial licensable porcine iPSC line. And they're working on beef and also ovine at the moment. So cell line and cell line development is a crucial part of everyone's process. Obviously, media components. We've talked about media today, but again, we're starting with many different species, many different starting cell types, and many different end cell types, all of which need media and components. And individuals, companies such as ourselves, can't do everything ourselves. I briefly mentioned the role of precision fermentation. Scaffold and microcarriers are a big part. So we need to, I guess, produce the greatest mass of cells that we can, and using microcarriers for that is one way. And also scaffolding is important, I think, for the future due to muscles' innate morphology and structure. So if we want to actually truly replicate a piece of meat, we're going to have to move beyond just 3D printing a piece of cells in a hydrogel and move to scaffolding systems that allow cells to expand and form appropriate morphologies. Bioreactors and bioprocessing is a huge part of what we do, and it's one of the most important things when I'm talking to investors, and we'll talk a little bit about money in a bit. Bioprinting and extrusion technologies are also of paramount importance that we're always looking at. Apart from these sort of the obvious biology-related avenues to look at for startups, there is also a bunch of other sort of periphery areas that need to be developed. So marketing. As a scientist, I'm a terrible marketer, and this has been a huge part of my role here. So companies exist for helping scientists such as ourselves to, I guess, be better marketers. Obviously, the cellular agriculture community is about helping the environment, improving environmental processes. So things like distribution and packaging is highly important for development. So there's a company that works in the same space as us that works with compostable plastics, which are used for food purposes. So things like that to, I guess, increase the greenness of our technologies. Energy is important. So there are, the bioreactor systems are highly energy intensive. And so we need to work on efficiency in energy acquisition and storage for these processes. And I am a little bit biased because I come from a farming background myself, but I think avenues to work with farmers to repurpose the agricultural land that's currently being used and provide alternative income streams for those farmers, as well as revegetation and carbon farming and all those sorts of things. So there are so many opportunities for startup development in Australia. So in terms of facilities and infrastructure, everyone has the idea about startups starting in the garage, and that's basically how we started. And I started at Magic Valley. So I was sitting in my house, spare bedroom, 3D printing syringe pumps and microfluidic devices to produce microcarriers in my house, and then sending them to the lab to be tested. And there are certain bits of work that can be done in that way, but it's not too long before you have to move into a more structured facility. So in terms of what's available in Australia and also in Victoria, it's actually quite limited at the moment. So I'll just give a brief outline of what's available. So there are places like Eastern Innovation, which are out in Clayton, which can provide small, I think around 10 square meter spaces. It's very difficult to get the space because they're always booked out. and they work on like a month-by-month sort of process. The other company that's here in Brunswick actually is called CoLabs, and as the name suggests, it's a co-working laboratory space. So you rent benches, and then there is amount of shared equipment, and then you rent your bench and you can bring in your own equipment and all those sorts of things. So you can see here on the right-hand side, this is actually Magic Valley's footprint within CoLabs, and then there's the shared equipment surrounding that. I guess moving past that, then we move on to larger facilities. So up in the Gold Coast, there is a place called Cohort, which is a laboratory setting where you can rent out a dedicated lab space. So it's like 60 square meters for yourself or your other labs. But I guess the entry point for that is a bit higher because you need the rent and then all of the equipment yourselves. And then as you move on and you get a little bit bigger as well, there are companies such as Yield who started in Sydney and then they're expanding into Melbourne and Brisbane. And they sort of can generate bespoke laboratory fit outs for startups and other businesses. So in terms of the future of facilities in Australia for cultivated meat, I guess I made it sound like it's all sort of doom and gloom, but it's not actually the case. So CoLabs and Cohort are both funded by their respective governments, so the Victorian government and the Queensland government to some regard. And so we've got now successful proof of concept that co-working laboratory spaces do actually work. And so there's been recognition and there's a huge demand for these sorts of spaces, and the government has been taking notice. So we're constantly in talks with the co-working lab space people and also the government, and things are moving forward in terms of developing more space for the industry. The other option, which seems obvious, is working with universities to provide lab space. Traditionally, it's been quite difficult to work within that sort of infrastructure because they're looking for longer term tenants, and sometimes the terms aren't sort of agreeable for an early stage startup. But there's been a lot of work in the last even 6 months with universities around Melbourne, particularly, where they've sort of rejigging the model to allow for sort of a rental of space, no IP exchange, and all those sorts of things. So in terms of moving forward, I think the future is very bright for cell ag startups in Australia, with more and more facilities being made available. In terms of funding, there was a whole session on funding, so I guess you guys probably know, but we have multiple avenues. We start with the founder and family friends, and this is to sort of get the first proof of concept, or you're just ideas fully pictured before moving on to pre-seed and seed funding with angel investors. And this is hundreds of thousands to maybe a few million. And then you can go through multiple series of A to D funding through venture capital, and this is your tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, which is looking forward. Apart from the sort of traditional funding trajectory, there are also multiple other funding opportunities. So as I said, the government is realizing how beneficial this is and how much has been invested elsewhere in the world, and this is starting to be reflected in Australia. So back in 2019, I believe, there was granted some seed funding by the New South Wales government, and more recently this year, Change Foods, in collaboration with the Queensland government and QT, secured $1 million to sort of bridge a gap between agricultural wastes and the cell ag community. There are places like GFI who provides some granting systems, and also there's real opportunities to partner with some big players in the industry. So places like Sartorius and Thermo, for example, again, they've seen the trajectory in the rest of the world on cell ag, and they're more than willing to talk to companies and talk about their technologies and how there are potential partnerships available to move forward. So I guess just a summary, what the future of cultivated meat startups look like in Australia. Basically, we have the opportunities, like every single aspect of cell cultured meat is still up for grabs. There's still being finalized processes, and we'll be optimizing our processes for quite a long time. So there's many, many opportunities for everyone. funding is available and there are many sources, and we now will have the facilities soon for everyone to sort of get easy access, which has not been there before. It took us quite a long time to find our lab space. So just want to say thank you, and if you have any questions and anything specific, just feel free to email me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacob. First of all, congratulations on your new position at Magic Valley. That is awesome. And we also heard you're recruiting people at the moment. So if you're looking for a job in this space, definitely contact Magic Valley. Also, yeah, that's really awesome that there's so many opportunities, facilities, and funding available. And maybe we should be starting up more companies from the alternative protein initiative.
Yeah, that's also another opportunity for startups, I guess, because CoLabs is essentially a startup kind of company. So yeah, providing those spaces is also something that can be explored further.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much, Jacob. All right, and last but not least, we have Dr. Dean Powell, who provides scientific and technical expertise for Good Food Institute Asia Pacific, focusing on cultivated meat. He holds a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with a focus on poultry muscle development and a bachelor's in animal and veterinary bioscience, both from the University of Sydney. Dean has experience working for the Australian federal government, both as a scientific assessor for food safe regulations and as an international policy analyst, focusing on the Asia Pacific region. Dean, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Marion. Very happy to be here and chat to everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cool. So let me share this screen. That should hopefully be all good.
All good.
Awesome. So I've kind of tried to frame this as how we can look at accelerating the alternative protein innovation ecosystem. We're already seeing a lot of great developments, but GFI's mission is always about how we can push this further and faster. So first, I'll just really quickly introduce GFI for those of you that might not be familiar with us. Kind of look at where developments in the cultivated meat sector globally are at the moment, look at how Australia fits into that global trajectory, and then dive a bit more specifically into what you all can do as students or young professionals that want to jump into this or skill yourselves up to increase your odds of making an impact in the cultivated meat sector. So for those of you that aren't familiar with GFI, Good Food Institute, we're a global network of nonprofits. We have 6 offices globally. I'm based in Sydney, but technically I work for our Singapore office, which covers the APAC region. And we have 120 staff globally. We're completely funded by charitable donations, so our mission is to support the whole sector. We don't accept payments from companies to help them. We just assess who we work with based on how much impact they could have. And so our whole mission is that we believe that accelerating the shift to a sustainable, healthy, and just food system through the use of alternative proteins will be the key answer to address global challenges such as climate change and food security with a growing global population. We've heard a lot about that today, so I'm sure you all have had enough of the reasons behind the sector. So to do this, GFI focuses on 3 main areas of work that we have on the screen here. So I sit in our science and technology team, where we do a lot of strategic analysis to identify the key bottlenecks facing the industry. We help mobilize funding, both with our own grant program and by encouraging others to fund work and research projects. And we also have a real focus on talent development and helping develop the workforce for this sector. Outside of that, we have a corporate engagement department, so we consult a lot with the investor communities and food companies, right from an individual looking to start their own startup through to the largest multinational meat and food companies in the world. And finally, we have a policy department where we're looking to help carve a smooth path for implementation of these new technologies and mobilize public funding and research dollars into them. So at this point, we've all heard about these 3 pillars of alternative proteins as we as an organization kind of characterize it. Everyone knows what plant-based meat is and cultivated meat as the topic of today. And we have talked about fermentation in different forms, but we look at fermentation both as a biomass, so where you actually grow a microbe for its own protein content, or precision fermentation where you're using the microbial cells as a mini factory to create your ingredients that might go into a plant-based product or a cultivated product. And I wanted to highlight this because as we look ahead for the future of this sector, we don't, as an organization, GFI, don't see these 3 alternative protein platforms remaining as very distinct industry segments. but rather as one large industry where we'll have animal product alternatives across the spectrum, utilizing ingredients from one or more technology to create the best tasting and lowest cost products possible. And so we just have some examples on the screen here, but today I'll just focus on the cultivated meat side of this. But just for everyone to keep in mind, if cultivated meat might not be, the main area of interest or the area that you're studying in, there are ways that, if you're a crop scientist, that you will be contributing to cultivated meat potentially in the work you do, or how you could look at tying that into the fermentation sector as well. So if we look at the sector's developments broadly, first here, I just have a graph that I think is a really interesting comparison. So you have to look at the comparative cost of changing technologies and how they're not linear. Often as developments progress, you start to see a kind of logarithmic change in the cost or cost effectiveness of these technologies. So the blue line here is one example where we had the cost of genome sequencing. So the first genome sequence cost $100 million, and it's now less than $1,000 to sequence a whole genome. This is a level that a number of analysts thought we wouldn't reach until the year 2030, but instead managed to do that $1,000 cost level by 2018. So there's a lot of predictions that are talked about. There are some today, but it is very hard to predict how fast technology will develop. If we look at cultivated meat, the reduction in cost is actually even steeper than that we saw for genome sequencing. So year zero here was 2013 when we had the first $300,000 burger unveiled by Professor Mark Post. And some companies now estimating their cost to be as low as $40 per kilogram. And this is in the range of high-end meat cuts or particular breeds, if you look at some of the more expensive seafood species, for example. So we're seeing rapid drops in cost, and this is opening up a lot of opportunities for different companies to begin looking at commercialization of their products. And so if we look at the actual production process itself, so this graph kind of, if you look from left to right, these are the different stages companies have to go through where they're looking to create a product and then move to market to sell it. So that first pre-commercial stage, this is where a lot of the work is going to be happening in those facilities that Jacob was just talking about, where you're at an actual lab bench developing your prototypes. So the first companies in this space were doing this in 2013. So this was, the leading 3 or 4 companies back then. Where we're at now is, you can see the darker gray line on the back of this slide. That's kind of the leading edge of the industry at the moment. So we've started to see the first companies are at what we call pilot scale. So pilot scale is where it's still relatively small, but it actually replicates what a commercial process will look like as opposed to a lab bench process. So with this in mind, where are we exactly at in this production life cycle for the sector? So you can see at the pilot scale, I think we estimate based on what's been publicly announced that there might be around 12-ish companies operating at the pilot scale, which is from 50 liters to maybe 1,000 liter bioreactors. That number was around the end of 2021, so it might be a little bit higher now. And on the right there, we just have a few of the stated capacity that companies are operating at. So Wildtype is a company in the US that's doing sashimi for sushi purposes, salmon sashimi, I should say. And they're looking at up to 100 tons per year. Still relatively small amounts, but it's light years ahead of where we were at just at that beginning conceptualization stage in 2013. And really excitingly, just in May this year, the US company Good Meat, which is part of Eat Just, that also does plant-based egg, announced that they're going to be constructing the world's first commercial scale production facility for cultivated meat in the US. And so they state that the bioreactors in this facility are going to be able to grow more than 13,000 tons of chicken and beef a year by 2030. It's going to have 10 bioreactors that have up to 250,000 liter capacity each. So each of those bioreactors would be as tall as a 4-story building. So you can imagine this is an extremely large facility. And if they successfully pull this off, it would actually be the largest bioreactors to ever culture mammalian cells globally. So cultivated meat is growing mammalian cells, but the biopharmaceutical industry also grows mammalian cells for some of its medical products development purposes. But the scale in that sector, I believe, hasn't gone above 20,000 liters in a commercial setting. So Eat Just is looking to go more than 10 times above that with its 250,000 liter bioreactors. So this is extremely exciting development. As a trailblazer, this is also the same company that got the first regulatory approval in Singapore, and this will really help increase confidence in the sector if they manage to do this right and make it work. So let's look a little more specifically at Australia now. So Susie, in the last section of the conference, and Jacob just then also noted that we have 9 cell air companies in Australia now. That was from 1 in 2018, but the potential in Australia is massive. So I've just got some figures on the screen here. This was from a National Synthetic Biology Roadmap report that CSIRO released last year. And so based on this, they were looking at projecting how big this sector could be in Australia by the year 2040. And so based on this graph on the right, or table, I should say, they calculated that the whole sector for food and agriculture, so this includes precision fermentation, includes cultivated meat, but also includes other crop-related applications of these technologies, could be worth up to $20 billion by 2040 and directly employ up to 31,200 Australians. So there's massive potential here. And I will say, from one of my conversations with CSIRO recently, they were relaying how talent in the synthetic biology space related to fermentation is very tight, and students that are finishing masters and PhDs are being snapped up with job offers before they've even finished their projects. So it's a good sector to be in at the moment. The sector's hungry for talent. And then just this other image on the right here, it's mapping out some of the different centers of excellence and organizations that are working in this space around the country. So there are a number that are active. For those of you that might be looking for, a master's opportunity, a PhD opportunity, working as a research lab technician, etc. And so another way to look at the sector's development in the country is follow the money. Again, Jacob mentioned 1 or 2 of the things on the screen here, but the federal and state governments in Australia are taking notice and beginning to provide significant funds to alternative proteins. So based on the most immediate technology readiness level of plant-based meat, this has been receiving the largest funding focus so far, given that it is ready for commercialization. Money that goes into this can turn into results very quickly. And this is followed by precision fermentation, where we've seen the next largest amount of funding going towards it from government sources. And again, from my conversations with CSIRO, they've discussed that the current technology readiness level of cultivated meat is still too low to be a major pillar for them to focus on. But as the technology is proven out and develops, this too will likely begin to see more tangible monetary and R&D support. One really exciting development at the moment is Research and Industry Consortium bidding for government funding to establish an alternative protein cooperative research center, or CRC. So for those of you that haven't heard of CRCs, this is a program whereby an industry and research consortium will get together, promise to put a X amount of money towards research and development of a certain industry. They apply to the government, and then the government can match that with an equal amount of funds to set up this organization and conduct research and commercial development work. So this alternative protein CRC, I believe they have amassed around $20 million in commitments from various companies and commercial and research partners. And they're seeking up to another $20 million over 10 years from the federal government to match that and set up this alternative protein cooperative research center. So I personally gained my PhD through a poultry science cooperative research center. I think it was about a decade ago now, or close to. And so from my personal experience, I know that this can be a very powerful vehicle for students to become professionals in the sector if it's successfully funded later this year. So I encourage everyone to keep your eyes out for developments on that front. And so I thought another way to think about where Australia might be heading is to look at some examples of data that I collected from a recent industry survey in Singapore. So I did outreach to all of the cultivated meat and fermentation startups in Singapore, asking them about their types of talent needs at the moment. And so given that Singapore is probably a couple of years ahead compared to Australia in both the government support and commercial side of things, I think this is a good indicator of where things might be heading, given that Singapore and Australia have quite similar levels of scientific technological expertise, and also similarly fairly well-regarded and strong regulatory environments that can provide business certainty on the other side. So the most advanced company in Singapore was launched in 2018. So this is still a very young sector, but you can see on the screen here. So I managed to get results from 12 of the 16 companies in Singapore. Most of them are cultivated meats. This is really a cultivated meat survey. They're still quite small with around 5 to 9 people, the largest having between 50 and 99. 8 of the 12 are having moderately severe challenges finding talent at the moment. The overwhelming majority are looking for those R&D roles. So they really need scientists and engineers as opposed to kind of the more developed manufacturing side of house, which makes sense. The biggest bottleneck they see is geography. So the talent for these jobs exists elsewhere, mainly in Europe and the USA, is what I was told. So I think there's opportunities there, both for people with relevant skills in Australia. If you do want to move to Singapore, there's a lot of companies that will be looking at hiring. But there's also opportunities on the training front as well. They see that local training in Singapore isn't developing the skills they need. And I think there's a similar kind of environment in Australia at the moment. One exciting thing was I asked about their hiring plan, and they're looking at hiring north of 500 people for technical roles, specifically in this sector. So a lot of potential jobs coming in the near future. And when I asked these companies to select the top 5 technical skills or backgrounds they're looking for, I had a list of about 20. Some of them were relevant to cultivated meat, fermentation, or general skills. And I just picked out here, these are the top 6 that got votes from more than one company. And so the top trend for needed skills was related to kind of the chemical and biological science and engineering areas around manufacturing process, data science, and food science. However, based on the previous slide, these are still focused very much on that R&D stage as opposed to kind of the commercial industrial side of these skills. There are also many options related to kind of the upstream technology development. So your kind of cell biology side, for example, and also the downstream product development, where we had 1 to 2 companies saying those were kind of their top priorities for maybe more of the food scientist route. And so the overall trend that we got from this is that the sector in Singapore is anticipating quite strong growth with over 500 technical roles predicted, as I mentioned. And we already have a talent bottleneck. One point, they're seeking foreign talent. I know, a number of Australians have gone over there and to other companies to get jobs at these companies. Australian skills are highly valued, and our university and research training system is well respected. And I know at least one Singaporean cultivated meat company, Shiok Meats, is actually opening a research lab in Sydney to tap on local talent here, as well as access our local seafood species. And one other point that would be of interest is that companies are most interested in helping foster talent through internships. So I'd say practice your networking skills and keep an eye on these companies for opportunities. George from Powell was a great example of that. They're looking for student talents to help build their workforces up. So from here, what can you do right now to help improve your chances of getting into this sector? My first suggestion is, if you're not a member, join the University of Melbourne Alternative Protein Initiative. One area we've seen students have really great impact is actually to help develop more alternative protein courses and learning opportunities around the world. So you can see on this map, which is looking at active and developing courses that focus on one area or all of alternative proteins. Australia is a bit naked at the moment, and that's something we want to see change. So a few of the alt protein project student groups affiliated with GFI have been working in this space. So it might sound like a big challenge trying to influence a university to actually provide new courses to students, but we've seen students driving forward many of these educational pathways around the world. In January, we had our Cambridge Alt Protein Society launch an alternative protein fundamentals program, where they did remote education of over 400 students, scientists, policymakers, and entrepreneurs around the alternative protein sector over a span of 8 weeks. We've also had the Stanford University group launch the second iteration of its Alt Protein Project-led course on rethinking meat. So they had around 300 registrants, up from 100 in their initial course. So we can see it's really strong interest in this. And finally, in May this year, our University of North Carolina Chapel Hill group wrapped up their first course dedicated to the science of cultivated meat in collaboration with several of the local professors there. And they're actually expecting this to become a permanent fixture in their biology department, taught every year by the local faculty. So we expect this trend to continue, and this is something I really hope to see students such as yourselves bring to universities in Australia as well. Thinking about yourselves personally though, GFI does have an online course. It's called Science Behind Alternative Proteins. So we've had over 9,000 enrollments globally for this, and we have done a recent refresh of this in the last 6 months. So it's a good time to look at that now where the data and topics are very up to date. One other point is that we're also beginning to see the emergence of new private sector solutions focused on helping the field overcome its talent bottlenecks. So there's some sector-specific recruiting and training organizations. I've just got one on the screen here called Talus, beginning to appear in the scene. So we see this as a really exciting signal of the maturity of the field increasing, given that there's now demonstrated business models from established fields for these types of talent-focused solutions and services. So hopefully we'll see some more of these and maybe eventually ones that are focused on Australia specifically. We also have a range of other databases and resources from GFI that could help you skill up in areas that you have a particular interest in. So I've been focusing on the scientific ones here, but we do have a lot more business-focused content, entrepreneurial content, and also some for those that might be more communications oriented as well. So some of the big ones, the Science of series is a very comprehensive look at all of the main components of the cultivated meat, how would you say, scientific skill sets. So we look at cell lines, scaffolding, the bioreactors, and product formulation. We link to a lot of the commercial developments, look at the recent scientific papers that have been published in these areas. So it's a good way to take a bit of a dive into these topics. Another interesting one is our collaborative researcher directory. So this is where you can connect to researchers who are active in alternative protein space and maybe looking to apply their expertise to the field. They might be looking for students. So this is a way you can look for potential supervisors if you want to try and get into a, again, master's or PhD program and need to find a supervisor to do so. And again, on the really important one for students is we do have a dedicated student guide as well. So I'd suggest checking that out. And just to finish up here, I think an important part of the work that we do at GFI is try to enable open access research. The final endpoint of all of the work that we do is to improve the sensory aspects of all protein products and help companies lower the cost of their production and enable quicker scale up. So for our grant program, researchers from academia, government, industry, and non-profits are eligible to apply. So anyone can apply, basically. And so far we've awarded over $13 million US to about 70, or maybe it's up to 80, 80 discrete projects since 2019. So our round of funding for this year is kind of wrapping up at the moment, but I will show on the bottom of the screen here that the release dates for our next call for proposals is probably going to be around February next year and then July next year. So linking that to the last point that I made, if you are interested, find a supervisor, show them this funding opportunity. And then in addition to that, there is also New Harvest, which has funding mechanisms directed specifically at students and young professionals. So I suggest checking them out as well. They're based in the US, but they fund people anywhere in the world. And so this is just a graph of academic reviews and publications from GFI's current and previous grantees. So you can see that the programs we've helped kickstart are beginning to accelerate their research outputs. And I think we're going to see that grow up pretty quickly. So some of our earliest grantees in the US have gone on to get the first National Science Foundation funding of cultivated meat ever, when they got $3.5 million funding for a program at the end of 2020. So we have had one grantee in Australia, but we are looking to support more as we see Australia being a great place to support research for the sector. So again, I know a number of our previous grantees only found out about alternative proteins because a student approached them, talked to them about the opportunities and got them interested. So this is a point where you can have real impact. You could talk to a professor who might become a leader in this field in Australia, and you can become a student under them, which would be a great opportunity. And the final resource to help with that is our Advancing Solutions for Alternative Proteins initiative. So for those of you with a particular interest in research, You can look at this database we've developed where our global scientific team has highlighted the details of the most pressing barriers facing the industry and potential research opportunities to address. So this is constantly updated as we continue to have conversations. People might tell us about a problem that's emerging for them, a technical barrier, a regulatory issue, a commercial opportunity. We'll write up a new concept note and we'll pop it in this database. So we're constantly updating it with fresh ideas. And it's a great one, again, for a researcher that might be interested in this sector. They could look at this and say, hey, my research actually links to this idea. I could apply for a grant and I think I'd be well positioned to actually get into this sector. So we see this being a really great tool to help those dip their first toe into the water in alternative proteins. And sorry if I went a little bit over time, but with that, I'll say thank you and happy to take some questions and have a good chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean. Seems like there's a lot of incredible opportunities for students and young professionals right now, both in funding, job opportunities. So yeah, very excited to get more of us on board as well. Also, thank you for the shout out, Dean. Yes, the Alternative Protein Initiative is affiliated with Good Food Institute as of a few weeks ago, and we'll be having that announcement quite soon with the adoption of the new logo and the new name. So thank you very much. All right, now I'll move on to the panel discussion. So make sure you submit your questions to the Q&A section now for Dean, Hope, and Jacob. But I do see now that there is a question, so I might move on to that directly. Yeah, if the panelists can come back on, that would be great. All right, so I think this is the question for Hope. Interesting to hear that there isn't a concern about feeding 9 billion people by 2050, nor is there a protein shortage. This is used in a lot of messaging by cell-like companies, so I'm keen to hear more on this from Hope.
Yeah, it's actually one of my favorite things to talk about, but my colleagues are sick of me going on about it. So obviously the world population is increasing, so we do need food to feed people. The problem is that we roughly waste 50% of the food that we produce on a global scale. The idea that policymakers ever intended for there to be a production goal for our food system just was picked up and became its own thing. But actually, to address food security, we really don't need to produce more food. We need to tackle structural poverty. And that requires multiple different things, including things like increasing education programs, targeting women in developing countries, low-income countries. So it's not sexy because it's not like a new product is required to help us reach those, to feed the growing population. That's a discourse that is very strongly critiqued amongst social scientists in the food security space. It does suit a private solution to complicated public interest issues, but as a whole, the FAO has said that we're not worried about producing more food to feed more people, and also we need to be considering a range of other things that cause food insecurity, and so increasing production really isn't the solution, and we already produce enough food to feed everyone, and and we still have millions of people who are hungry, and it's not because of a lack of food being produced. And we've known that since the 1970s, that actually food insecurity is caused by poverty primarily, and is an issue in low-income countries for farmers in particular areas and for urban poor, as not actually a problem of production. So yeah, it's kind of interesting because I get the logic in it. Oh, we're running out of food, but there's more people, we need to produce more food. It does logically seem to make sense, but when you actually unpack the drivers of food insecurity and our current production levels, there isn't a concern around that. Now, onto the protein part, and there's some really interesting work from Phil Howard and his team around how did this protein discourse become such a thing. And I think we can see that with diet culture and the focus on increasing levels of protein. There isn't a protein shortage. There is a food insecurity issue around hunger and also around nutritional issues, but it's not centered around protein. And so if we focus on one particular macronutrient, we're kind of overlooking the complex science that is nutrition that requires a range of nutrients to deal with different things. In the UK, the US and Australia, we're actually over-consuming protein against the recommended daily allowances. So we don't actually need more protein in at least developed countries. Of course, we do need to be tackling food insecurity in Australia, which is caused by economic insecurity, and it's not actually caused, of course, by a lack of food in Australia as well as on a global level. Yeah.
So can I just jump in, because I think it's great to have more nuance on that point. But I guess one thing I would say, because we do talk about growing population and need for alternatives, and I guess a different way to look at it is that consumer demand also drives production. So we see that the demand for actual meat products is going to grow significantly, and as a result, we can't produce the meat that consumers will demand using conventional production methods. So I think that's a different way to look at the reason why we need these alternatives, is because through the current system, we will push the environmental impacts higher by trying to provide meat that consumers want. And again, companies will try and provide that. So we're looking at the alternatives that will provide what consumers want with the lower environmental impact. And I guess that goes to the idea that a lot of nonprofits have been looking at trying to convince consumers not to eat meat for decades, but the ability to do so has been extremely limited. So this is seen as another way we can try and tackle that problem, given that convincing consumers just to stop eating meat hasn't worked.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I find in this space, people move between we're a complementary product, we're not competing with meat. And then they also say, but we will be replacing meat to a certain extent, because otherwise all of those claims about the environmental impact benefits we will have won't actually occur. So I just find it confusing, because on the one hand, they're complementary, they're not in competition. But on the other hand, if they're not in competition, then where will the environmental benefits come from?
Yeah, I guess it's partly that demand, as I was saying, will grow. So even if the current meat production stays where it is, these alternatives can account for growing demand. And the other point is probably that part of it comes down to the politics and marketing of it, where, especially in a place like Australia, the idea of replacing meat is very contentious. So the need to talk about it as complementary is more important. So companies might emphasize that more. And also it's a diverse sector. So different players have different opinions. Some do completely want to replace meat. Others are just seeing this as a more pragmatic, complementary source of food diversification. But it is confusing. I agree.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you for that debate. That was good. That's like a big talk, I think, in this space. So thank you for bringing that up and sharing your opinions on that. All right, since we're talking about this, maybe we can talk about this. I think there are some worries that cultivated meat will only be attainable by those that are wealthy. Are there initiatives or groups working on democratizing cultivated meat and looking at producing it in local communities?
Yeah, I know in Japan, it's probably the best example of this, where they have the Shojin Meat Project, which is looking at a very community-driven approach to this technology. I think practically in the short term, it will tend to be mostly the wealthy countries that can have access to cultivated meat. That is just the way that a product will develop, where it starts at that high level cost and will slowly over time work its way down. We are not focusing on cultivated meat for poverty alleviation, for example, going to Hope's point. But looking at the very long term, this could have an impact, when we're looking 50 years down the track, for example. But I'm not aware of any efforts right now to look at democratic access to cultivated meat. I think it's just too early for that, to be honest.
Okay, great.
I guess on that point, there is also a concern, and this I'm not commenting on this either way. It's just one of the things that has come up, which is that there'll be a double standard in our food system, where either cell cultured meat or conventional beef products will provide better nutrition, but one group will ultimately not be able to afford that other product. So I guess, and the concern is that wealthy consumers or high middle will be able to consume the better product and the more substandard, which we do see occurring in the meat sector broadly anyway. So this is not an issue for cultivated meat people to address per se. I think there is also a hope that, and whether or not this carries out is unclear, but through market signals, if we adopt enough cultured meat, that it does replace some animal agriculture to some extent, there might be some freeing up of croplands, which would lead to a reduction in the costs of fruit and vegetables. So that could flow on to have a more food security or better access for food for other groups. But obviously tackling food waste would also be useful in that space.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's a good point, because I believe I've heard elsewhere that the price of some staple crops is increased because it goes to animal feed as opposed to potentially being consumed by people, and that does impact some of these more price sensitive countries and regions.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, there's a question for Jacob. They say, great talk, Jacob. Do you think cell ag companies will focus on one or two materials, then collaborate with other companies, or is it more likely they will increase their focus?
Sure, definitely there's the need to focus in initially. And this is especially important when you're talking to an investor. They want to make sure you have the correct plan in place, and you're not overextending. And even though dealing with a lot of different materials or components or whatever your company is dealing in, even though it may seem logical to expand as much as you can initially, it actually can be quite a negative in terms of external investment, in terms of managing risk. We as a company talk to a lot of startup companies almost constantly about different materials and testing them out on our particular cells. At the moment, we're a very small company, so this is out of necessity. So we just have to sort of collaborate or and those sorts of things with other companies. Looking at the companies that have existed a little bit longer than us, it does seem that people have decided to bring as much in-house as possible, whether that's either through the recruitment of people with the skills or maybe acquisition of other smaller startups. So you can see a lot of cell culture meat companies that they have the cell biologists and the engineer type bioprocessing people, and then they have metatronics and software and all sorts of other types of people. So it's really hard. There's no one size fits all for every company, and you sort of have to be agile enough to deal with, I guess, what's happening in your local space.
Great, thank you very much, Jacob. Okay, I think we're now going to the far future a little bit. Does this have the potential to feed settlements in outer space? Should I ask Dean? I guess this is the future of cultivated meat. Someone's gonna ask.
Yeah, well, I guess it's not necessarily that far in the future, as I know that the company Aleph Farms in Israel has actually already done some projects in outer space. I'm not sure the exact details, but in 2019, they did create cultivated meat in space to some degree. At least they say on their website. And interestingly enough, one of the first academic papers looking at cultivated meat was around creating goldfish based meat. I think it was in 2003, and that was funded by NASA. So this is something that's been looked at for a little while already, actually.
That's super cool. Okay, maybe that's another startup space as well, creating space settlement food. Okay, another question. I think this might be for Dean and Hope. Are the factors that led to the successes seen in Singapore applicable to Australia?
Yeah, I guess just to continue on from some of the points I raised, the first bit would be that the Singapore government was very decisive in looking at supporting the sector. So they have a government policy called 30 by 30. Singapore is a small city state with almost no agricultural output. They import over 90% of their food. They set a target by 2030 to create 30% of their own nutritional needs. And as a part of that, they put dozens of millions of dollars towards alternative proteins research and development. And they have the Economic Development Board and Enterprise Singapore that actively support companies to move there and set up shop. So they've been extremely proactive, of course, on the regulatory front as well, the first country in the world to prove cultivated meat. So I wouldn't say that it's quite applicable across at the moment between Singapore and Australia, but as I mentioned, that we're starting to see funding in Australia move in this direction. the CSIRO roadmap talked a lot about alternative proteins, and even in federal government funding programs, they talk about alternative proteins as specific areas of opportunity for applications. So they're moving in that direction, but we're not where Singapore is yet. I hope we get there. I'm not sure if you had any other considerations, Hope.
I'm a bit more cynical about us responding in the same way as Singapore, but I think it's great that you outlined all the ways that Singapore has been super proactive, and also the way that their food and political context is different from our food and political context, that they're trying to increase their domestic production, but they have a very, very small land mass, and so they're large-scale importers. We are not that, and we have a very strong agricultural lobbying group that has a pretty clear stance so far on cell-cultured meat, and we can look at the US as another similar counterpart in that regard. Unlike the US, we do not have the same startup culture and investment in cell-cultured meat. Comparative, obviously significant gains have been made there. Singapore has publicly invested in cell-cultured meat, which makes their regulators more likely to be positive about this. I think it's in for a battle in Australia. If we've struggled enough with animal welfare labelling, with a range of other issues like vegetation management, based on our political dynamic with the National Party forming coalition government, etc. I think we're a very different category. Also, our regulatory system for food is more difficult than Singapore, which is actually not a food regulatory regime I would support. It's too closed. It doesn't allow for a democratic deliberation of a product. We saw with GM, if we don't have transparent processes that are engaging with stakeholders in a meaningful way, letting them be heard, letting people feel listened to and meaningfully engaging with them, then we're going to create consumer distrust and related issues. So we want a democratic food system regulatory approach that allows for different groups to have a say and allows for that to influence regulatory outcomes, because ultimately it is to the benefit of cell-cultured meat for that to, even though it might not seem like that in the short term. Whereas Singapore is a very different political culture, and they're allowed a much more closed regulatory process as well. So I would expect it to play out significantly different here than in Singapore, but much more similar to, say, the US.
I think that's why it's also quite important to start the outreach with farmers at the moment. So I guess we have this view of farmers where you've got the huge industrial like feedlot type thing, but most of the land is owned by your mum and dad farmers, such as my parents, and like, it's their livelihoods and all that sort of stuff. And it's, I guess it's very difficult for them to change, because they aren't making ridiculous amounts of money like these big end farms. So to actually do something different for them is too much of a risk. It's very difficult to transition. So that's why I think it's really important for us as a community to sort of start this outreach with farmers to provide alternative avenues for income and show them that there is a better way to give them an easier life, as well as just more income as well. And I think this could help to sort of shift this opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jacob. And I think that shows, like, when we're talking about regulation cell-cultured meat, we actually do need to be thinking very broadly about a range of different mechanisms in place beyond just that particular thing, because I think you're 100% correct there. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Really nuanced topics. Okay, topic. All right. So another question we have by Jacobo. He asks, will the cultivated meat sector require the establishment of a few large players to overcome barriers such as IP and economies of scale? Or economies of, it says economies of scale, but I think economies of scale.
I'd be interested in your thoughts, Jacob, as a startup in this space. Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a difficult thing. I guess as an early sort of startup, you kind of feel like you have to do everything, because I guess as a product, we're chasing the bottom end, like the cheapest possible way of producing media and our meat products at the end of the day. And it's hard to think, how partnering when people want their share of everything, which is bits of business, that's how things work. It's difficult to see how those things can work together. But having a media company that produces, we're going to need ridiculous amounts of media and components and resupplementation and all sorts of things. So it almost makes sense that it sort of has to go that route, because everyone having their own facilities for the production of those individual components is probably going to be difficult and problematic.
Yeah, I guess one interesting thing that we've been seeing around the world is partnerships where there'll be a large traditional food player will partner with these small IP and tech knowledge-heavy startups to form that partnership where you need these small, nimble companies that are kind of developing breakthrough technologies, but partner them with the expertise of that large economy of scale, supply chain, commercial scale, just food manufacturing. So we're seeing that happening a lot around the world, especially in APAC, where we don't have a lot of the startups. We're seeing these foreign startups come into APAC to partner with the big food players here. So that's one way I'm seeing this play out a lot.
There's also some research around the corporate consolidation or increased reduction in competition in the plant-based protein space, which is there's some really interesting research coming out around that. Another thing to note is that we saw with genetically modified organisms that IP can create, and this was discussed in the first session, significant barriers to market and lead to corporations needing to merge and work together just to have access to the basic knowledge and tools that they need to create products. So I think there is a risk in this space because it's so high tech, there's so many inputs and there's so many patents already emerging that could actually feed into corporate consolidation in this space. Yeah, but it's all up for the future to decide, I guess.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I think I have time for one or two more questions, so I'll go ahead and ask that. We are looking at cultivated meat for this conference. What other cultivated products should come in the future?
I think the most apparent ones would be dairy. So there's a few companies that are looking at recapitulating dairy meat by growing mammary cells. Another interesting application is a similar thing, but in human, using human breast mammary cells. So instead of just looking at that as a food product, they're looking at that more as a medical product to feed to babies that have very specific needs and can't necessarily use formula. So I think that's a really cool, going into more of the biopharma space almost, but it's kind of bridging that gap with food. Outside of that, the materials world, you might be able to see leather that's derived from cultivated cells. That's maybe more going towards using mycelia and fungi to create leather, but there's possibility that you could look at this as well. Also then cocoa for chocolate, like plant cell culture I'm saying there. So moving away from the mammalian cells into plant opportunities as well.
Does anyone else want to comment as well? Maybe Jacob, if you're interested. Well, I guess you're doing one already, but other products you'd be interested in seeing in the future?
I guess that you did mention eggs as well. Eggs is another thing that people are trying to, or have produced or producing different egg components, almonds, and the fats associated with the egg yolk and those sorts of things. There are, I guess, other parts of the animal that we use and consume apart from, I guess, meat, like skeletal muscles. So there are other components which could be expanded into liver and kidneys and other things for consumption. I guess there's also the potential, like cocoa and coffee has been sort of flung around, and other sort of small molecules for flavor rather than just producing a whole plant or something like that.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. There's another question. I think that this might be our last one. So what are the best resources or platforms to stay up to date with the latest cell ag developments? It might be for Dean or anyone who wants to chip in.
I guess I'll say you should probably check out all the GFI blogs, webinars, and our media channels. So for all the different things we do, if you follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter, that's probably the best way to kind of stay up to date. We also have email subscriber lists you can follow as well. But outside of that, I mentioned New Harvest. They're another great one to look at. But I might leave it to the others here for others.
Follow the Alternative Protein Initiative. We'll have more events like this coming up. Cultivated, well, cellular agriculture, but as well as other kinds of alternative proteins. And we'll have more educational events like this where we can have discussions and learn more together. So awesome. Thank you very much. All right. So I think I will wrap it up. Now, I think Marcella, you might have these slides on hand. Would you be able to share? All right. So that is, yeah. Oh, actually, do any of the panelists want to, do you guys have any closing remarks that you would like to add on before I move on?
Just thanks for having me, and I hope people found that interesting. And if anyone wants to reach out to me to follow up on any of the points I mentioned, please do. Just email me directly. And I want to say thanks, Hope, for some of the points you raised are very interesting, and I think they're things we need to consider more and bring into our conversations to get a better nuanced understanding of some of these topics. So thanks for those.
Oh, thanks, Dean. Yeah, well, I mean, that's why academics exist, I guess, and why you guys exist. So, and this is why these events are useful and important, because I certainly learned a lot as well. So thank you.
Oh, allowing cross-collaborative communication and yeah, sorry, go on, Jacob.
No, I was just going to say thank you. Keep it simple.
Well, thank you. A huge shout out to our wonderful speakers, Dean, Jacob, and Hope. Thank you so much. That was such a informative session and very, yeah, we just talked about it. It was a very balanced session, I think. So thank you very much. And now this concludes the last session of the State of Cultivated Meat in Australia conference. A huge thank you to all our speakers. Yes, Dean, Hope, and Jacob for this session, as well as 9 of all the amazing speakers who came and took time with sharing their knowledge with us today. We are so incredibly happy and lucky to have you here. Very lucky indeed. And also a huge thank you to all the attendees who stayed on. I don't know, like many of you stayed on the entire day, so I want to extend my gratitude. And I hope you learned something new. And thanks for joining, our the kind of events and project and supporting our efforts. We truly appreciate it. Also, thank you to the research team, Nidhi, Tech, and Marcella, also for doing all the, the background things that you guys don't see, but they're working on the organizing this conference together. It took a lot of emails and a lot of late night calls to get this together. So really appreciative of such an amazing committee that we have. Thank you so much. Also the marketing team for doing all the beautiful marketing. We wouldn't have been able to do all that and promote that everywhere without it. So thank you. And also Valerie from GFI APAC for providing the webinar access, because that was a logistical challenge that we had to overcome. Yes, and again, thank you all so much for coming. Now that is pretty much the end of this event. However, there is a networking session at 5 p.m. AEST where it's a very relaxed environment. We're going to talk about the conference. You can talk to some of the attendees and the panelists, maybe. So maybe we'll hope to see you there. Otherwise, let me do a little bit more promo. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so the University of Melbourne Alternative Protein Initiative, as Dean already talked about, gave us a shout out. Yes, we are a student organization and we're here to build a healthy, sustainable, and just food system by, creating this robust and collaborative community around alternative protein education, research, and innovation. So if you found all this interesting today, definitely check us out because we have a lot of developments. Next slide, please. Yes, we have all these different events going on. So we have a snack and chat where you can come along and eat some plant-based food while we discuss the cool topics around alternative proteins. We're organizing a hands-on science program as well. And I think I saw Jacob at Collabs for that. We are organizing a lot of various educational events as well as social outings and events, and also doing food outreach to get more consumer acceptance around alternative proteins. And the other thing is that we are surveying for student interest. So if you found this conference really insightful, then definitely check out the surveys that are being launched very soon, where we will be collecting student voices and seeing how many people actually want to learn about alternative proteins more in their curriculums. And we can then use that in support to get more of these topics in our curriculums. So that would be really, really helpful as well. So definitely check it out. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And yes, so you can get involved by signing up as a member. That's right, you'll see all the updates to our events and projects. And we also have a SGM, a special general meeting coming up very soon, where we will be electing new committee members. So if you would like to get on board and join our committee to organize these awesome events, definitely come approach us. We are more than happy to have you on board. And also there are a lot of upcoming events, so definitely check us out. All right, now just to wrap things up, yes, the Cellular Agriculture Australia resources are available. We talked about this in session 1, but if you want to learn more and see how you can get involved in the cellular agriculture cultivated meat space, then definitely check these different resources out. And as Dean mentioned, GFI also has their own resource as well, which is the online course about the science behind alternative proteins, and you can learn more about them in your own time as well. So thank you very much. So that's the end of the conference, and I guess the next event is 5 p.m. AEST for the networking sessions. Also, if you are based in Melbourne, there is an event coming up next Friday with Cellular Agriculture Australia, where we will be talking about opportunities in cellular agriculture, how students can get involved, and it's an in-person event as well. So that's next Friday at Uni Melb. Details will be posted on the social media platforms. And if you got any feedback for us, then definitely check out that QR code and provide us with some juicy feedback, and we'll take that on board for organizing our next events and things like that. So thank you very much, everyone. And congratulations. We learned so much about cultivated meat today, I think. All right.
Thanks, Marion. Catch you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.